A fishing rod bends, a walleye takes the line, and on a small screen mounted to the boat, a shape appears at the bottom of the Mississippi River that has no business being there. It is August 2025. 22-year-old Brody Locke is fishing with a friend near Sartell, Minnesota, using a sonar fish locator he had bought only days earlier. The shape on the screen is long, rectangular, unmistakably man-made. His first thought is that it might be a rock. It is not a rock. Divers will confirm within days that it is a car that has been sitting on the riverbed for 58 years. Somewhere inside it is the answer to a question that has haunted one Minnesota county since 1967. What happened to Roy Benn? He was 59 years old, a businessman, a widower. He finished breakfast at a café on the edge of the river, got into his Buick, and was never seen again. He did not use a bank account. He did not cash a check. His car was never spotted on another road in another state in another decade. For 58 years, investigators searched quarries. They dug up ground where they suspected a body might have been buried. They chased leads that went nowhere. The car had been in the river the entire time, a few hundred yards from where he was last seen alive. This is the story of how a man can disappear so completely that an entire community assumes the worst, and how the truth, when it finally surfaces, is not always the crime everyone expected. In the fall of 1967, Roy George Benn was by most measures a man in the middle of rebuilding his life. He lived in Sauk Rapids, Minnesota, a small city on the east bank of the Mississippi River, just across the water from St. Cloud, roughly 75 miles northwest of Minneapolis. He ran the St. Cloud Appliance Repair Service, a business that had put him in touch with much of the community for years. He had been married, but his wife had died the previous year, leaving him a widower at 59. And only about 6 weeks before he disappeared, he had bought a 12-unit apartment building in Sauk Rapids, a significant investment for a man his age, and a sign that he was not planning to go anywhere. Records from the time describe him as 5 feet 8 inches tall, a stout build with thinning dark brown hair and gray eyes, a scar above one eyebrow. The kind of ordinary physical description that exists in a file precisely because no one expected to need it for very long. On the evening of September 24th, 1967, Ben was seen at King's Supper Club, a restaurant along Highway 10 in Sartell. He was dressed for the occasion, a dark suit, a red tie, a white French cuff shirt, and a pair of gold and pearl cufflinks. It was, by every account, a normal night out. What happened between that evening and the following morning is where the timeline gets its first correction, a small one, but the kind of detail that matters in a case built almost entirely on last sightings. Investigators later determined that Ben was not seen for the final time at the supper club the night before. He was seen again hours later at around 4 o'clock in the morning, eating breakfast at a café attached to a gas station on the east side of the Mississippi River in Sartell. He was still wearing the same suit. He got into his car, a 4-door metallic blue 1963 Buick Electra, Minnesota license plate 6DU516, and drove off into the early morning dark. He was reportedly carrying a large sum of money. Investigators at the time estimated it could have been as much as $5,000, a substantial amount in 1967. And one that would immediately shape how the case was understood. Because Ben lived alone, no one reported him missing right away. There was no spouse to notice an empty side of the bed, no children waiting for a phone call. Days passed before anyone recognized that something was wrong. The first newspaper account of his disappearance did not run until September 28th, 3 days after that breakfast at the cafe. By then, Roy Benn, his car, and whatever money he was carrying had vanished as completely as if none of it had ever existed. Once Ben's disappearance was reported, the Benton County Sheriff's Office opened a missing person investigation, and almost immediately, the case presented investigators with a problem that would define it for the next 5 decades. There was nothing to work with. No collision was reported, no struggle was documented. No witness came forward describing anything unusual at the café or along Highway 10 that morning. What investigators did have was a list of things that had not happened. And in a missing person case, absence of evidence can become its own kind of evidence. Ben never touched his bank account again. He never wrote another check. His credit cards, to the extent he used them, went untouched. His car was never re-registered under a new owner, never spotted in another state, never towed from another roadside. A man who owned a functioning business and had just purchased an apartment building simply stopped generating any of the financial or bureaucratic trace that ordinary life leaves behind. For investigators working the case in the late 1960s, that combination of facts pointed in one direction: a widower alone carrying a large amount of cash, vanishing without ever spending a dollar of it. The working theory was not an accident. It was a man who had very plausibly been targeted, robbed, and killed, with his car and his body disposed of somewhere he would never be found. The difficulty was that a theory is not a location. Investigators had a strong suspicion about what might have happened to Roy Benn. They had almost nothing about where. Sartell sits directly on the Mississippi River, and Highway 10 runs along it. The geography gave investigators 2 broad possibilities from the very beginning. Something had happened to Ben on land in the surrounding countryside, or something had happened to him on or near the water he had just driven past. Both possibilities would be pursued. Neither would produce an answer for a very long time. Ben's brother, Walter Benn, worked directly with law enforcement in the years after the disappearance, helping investigators chase down leads as they came in. None of them held up. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself for the rest of the 20th century. A family member willing to help, investigators willing to follow every lead available, and a case that kept refusing to move forward. Over the following years, investigators pursued the land theory with real persistence. Central Minnesota is dotted with abandoned quarries, deep water-filled pits left behind by decades of mining. And more than once, searchers dove into them, looking for a car that might have been pushed in and abandoned. Other searches targeted stretches of roadside where a body could plausibly have been buried in the rush of a cover-up. Officers dug into the ground on the strength of tips, theories, and educated guesses about where a killer in 1967 might have chosen to hide the evidence. None of it produced Roy Benn. This is the part of the case that easily gets compressed into a single sentence. The case went cold, but it is worth sitting with what that actually meant in practice. It meant that for years, investigators kept returning to a widening list of places Ben could theoretically be, and finding again and again that he was not there. Each failed search did not just fail to find him. It quietly narrowed the map of where investigators believed they should be looking, without ever pointing clearly toward the place he actually was. By the mid-1970s, with no trace of Ben, his car, or the money he had been carrying, he was declared legally dead, a legal formality that let his affairs be settled. But that answered none of the actual questions his disappearance had raised. Who, if anyone, had taken his life? Where his remains might be? Whether the large sum of cash he was carrying had anything to do with what happened to him at all? For most of the next 5 decades, the case existed in the space reserved for the truly unresolved. A name in a cold case file, a missing person bulletin issued by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, periodically revisited, but never meaningfully advanced. The theory that had shaped the investigation from day one, robbery, then murder, then concealment, and was never disproven. It simply had nowhere left to go. Inside the family, the case became something closer to folklore than an open investigation. Roy Benn's great-nephew, Jeff Benn, was a toddler in 1967. He grew up on stories, rumors, and competing theories about what the family came to call simply the family mystery. By the time he was an adult, he'd made peace with the idea that it likely never would be solved. It was history, not an active case. A name mentioned at family gatherings, not a file anyone expected a phone call about. What changed the case in the end was not a new suspect or a new confession. It was a piece of biology collected quietly years before anyone knew it would matter. At some point, roughly 7 years before the case broke open, the Benton County Sheriff's Office conducted a review of Roy Benn's file. It was the kind of routine cold case revisit that many sheriff's offices perform on their oldest unsolved cases. Not because a new lead had emerged, but because the tools available to investigators had changed enough that an old case was worth a second look. As part of that review, investigators collected a familial DNA sample from Benn's surviving relatives. There was no vehicle to test it against yet, no remains to compare it to. It went into a file, a genetic marker waiting for a use that, as far as anyone knew at the time, might never come. That single decision, made years before anyone had heard of Brody Locke or his new sonar fish locator, is the reason the case was solvable at all once the car was finally found. The technology that finally located Benn's car was not designed for cold cases at all. A recreational sonar fish locator sends sound waves down through the water and reads what bounces back. Letting anglers see the shape of the riverbed and anything sitting on it. Fish, logs, or in this case, the roofline of a car that had been down there since 1967. It is inexpensive, widely sold, and by 2025, common enough that a 22-year-old could buy one on a whim days before a fishing trip. For decades, the record of Benn's case shows almost no comprehensive search of the river itself. The investigative energy went into quarries and roadside ground, land-based locations that fit a robbery and concealment theory. Whether the stretch of the Mississippi near Sartell had ever been systematically scanned before 2025 is not something the public record establishes one way or the other. What's clear is that the tool that finally found the car was not a specialized piece of forensic equipment deployed by investigators. It was a consumer device in the hands of someone with no connection to the case, doing exactly what it was built to do. The sample came from Jeff Benn. In 2018, investigators asked him for a cheek swab, explaining that it might one day be useful if his great-uncle's remains were ever located. He gave it, understanding at the time that the odds of that phone call ever coming were slim. For 7 years, that was where the case stood. A genetic sample on file and a family story that had long since settled into the shape of an unsolved mystery rather than an active investigation. The discovery itself owed nothing to that preparation. It owed everything to chance. On Sunday, August 10th, 2025, Locke was fishing with a friend on the Mississippi River near Sartell. His friend had just caught a walleye. Locke, watching the new sonar unit he had purchased only days before, noticed a shape on the screen. Long, straight edge sitting on the riverbed, roughly 20 to 24 feet down. His first instinct was skepticism. It looked, he said, like it could be a rock. It was not a rock. Locke reported what he had seen to authorities, and the Stearns County Sheriff's Office took the report seriously enough to investigate. For a case that had been shaped by land-based searches for the better part of 6 decades, the water had suddenly become the more promising direction, not because of any new theory, but because of an angler who happened to be in the right stretch of river with the right piece of consumer electronics. 3 days after Locke's report, on Wednesday, August 13th, the Stearns Benton County Sheriff's Office dive team went into the Mississippi River near Riverside Avenue North in Sartell to confirm what the sonar had suggested. They found a car resting on the riverbed, a 1960s-era Buick filled with decades of accumulated river sediment sitting roughly 20 feet below the surface. Not far geographically from the café where Roy Benn had eaten his last known meal 58 years earlier. Sheriff Steve Soika of Stearns County later said he was concerned the vehicle might not survive being brought to the surface. A car that has spent close to 6 decades submerged is not simply old. Its metal has been slowly breaking down the entire time, and dive teams and similar recoveries have seen vehicles collapse or fragment the moment they are lifted out of the water and into open air. That did not happen here. When the dive team worked the car loose from the sediment, and a local towing company, Collins Brothers Towing, pulled it free of the river, it came up, in Soika's word, surprisingly intact, severely deteriorated but whole enough to be transported to the Sartell Police Department for processing. What investigators found inside changed the entire shape of the case in a matter of hours. Alongside personal items belonging to Ben, they found human remains. A team pulled together from the Sartell Police Department, the Benton and Stearns County Sheriff's Offices, and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's crime scene team examined the vehicle. They matched its vehicle identification number to the 1963 Buick Electra, registered to Roy Benn. Based on that match, the personal items recovered, and the presence of human remains, officials said publicly that they believed they had found both the man and the answer his family had waited 58 years for. Benton County Sheriff Troy Heck was careful in his public statements not to overstate what was still unconfirmed. He noted that some of the identification techniques a medical examiner would normally rely on were unlikely to be effective given how long the remains had been underwater. What he could say was that the evidence pointed strongly in one direction, and that Ben's surviving relatives, the family that had provided a DNA sample years earlier for exactly this possibility, had already been notified. It was not yet confirmation. It was, for the first time in nearly 6 decades, something close to it. Identifying remains that have spent 58 years underwater is not a simple process, and the Midwest Medical Examiner's Office faced real limitations from the start. Nearly 6 decades of submersion had reduced the remains to bone. That single fact eliminated 2 of the most common identification tools available to a medical examiner. Fingerprints require soft tissue that no longer existed. Dental records require a dentist's office and X-ray files that, for a man who had last seen the dentist sometime before 1967, were almost certainly long gone. The practices closed, the paperwork destroyed or lost. Shane Sheets, director of the Midwest Medical Examiner's Office, explained the process at the time. A bone sample would be used to extract a DNA profile, which would then be compared directly against the cheek swab already on file from a living relative. Had that comparison failed for any reason, the fallback would have been to submit the profile to a national genetic database in hopes of finding a more distant family match, a slower, less certain path than the one investigators actually had available to them thanks to the sample collected years earlier. Sheets also credited the dive team with moving quickly once the vehicle was located, praising the recovery as an efficient piece of logistics that got the remains to the medical examiner's office with minimal delay. That efficiency mattered. Skeletal remains that had survived nearly 6 decades underwater were fragile, and further deterioration during a slow or mishandled recovery could have compromised the sample before it was ever tested. On September 5, 2025, the Benton County Sheriff's Office announced the result. The remains recovered from the Buick were positively identified through familial DNA as Roy George Benn. 58 years after he walked out of a café into the early morning dark, the question of where he had gone was finally answered, but one question remained open, and it was the question that had shaped the entire case from the very beginning. What had actually happened to him? The working theory since 1967, robbery followed by murder, the body and car deliberately hidden, had never been proven, but it had never been ruled out either. It was the assumption underneath every quarry dive and every roadside dig for nearly 6 decades. The medical examiner's conclusion, delivered in November 2025, reversed that assumption entirely. After completing their examination, officials determined that Ben died as a result of a single motor vehicle crash with water submersion. There was no evidence that anyone else had been involved. His death was ruled accidental, and the Benton County Sheriff's Office formally closed the case. The man who had been carrying a large sum of cash, who had vanished without a trace, who had seemed for 58 years like the victim of a robbery gone wrong, had instead driven, for reasons that will never be fully known, off the road and into the Mississippi River, alone in the dark on his way home. It's worth being precise about what the evidence in this case actually proves and what it does not. It proves that Roy Benn's car went into the Mississippi River near Sartell, close to where he was last seen. It proves, through vehicle identification and familial DNA, that he died in that car. It proves through a medical examiner's finding that the cause was a crash followed by submersion, and that investigators found no evidence anyone else was involved. It does not prove why. No official account explains what caused a 59-year-old man driving a route he likely knew well to leave the road in the dark hours of a September morning. That detail, the actual moment of the crash, whatever combination of road conditions, fatigue, or misjudgment produced it, died with him in 1967 and was never going to surface no matter how advanced the forensic science became. Some things a river simply cannot answer, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said honestly is this: for 58 years, an entire community operated on the assumption that Roy Benn had been the victim of a crime, that someone had taken his money and made sure he was never found. That assumption was not unreasonable. It was the only theory the available facts seemed to support, but it was still, in the end, an assumption, and it was wrong. The geography of the case is its own quiet lesson. Investigators spent decades searching quarries and roadside ground across central Minnesota, places that made sense for someone trying to conceal a crime. The actual answer was in the water Ben had driven past that same morning, close enough that a fisherman with a new sonar unit could stumble onto it in a single afternoon, not hidden by a killer's planning. Hidden simply because no one had looked there in the right way with the right equipment until technology and chance happened to intersect. For Ben's surviving relatives, the case's end brought something the family had waited nearly 6 decades for. An answer, even if not the one everyone had spent 58 years expecting. Jeff Benn, who had given that cheek swab back in 2018 without any real expectation it would ever be used, later said he was shocked when investigators finally called. A story he had grown up treating as unsolvable, a piece of family folklore rather than an open case, turned out to have an ending after all. The Benton County Sheriff's Office, in closing the case, thanked the agencies that had worked it across generations of investigators. A reminder that a case this old is rarely solved by one person but by a long chain of people, starting with Roy's brother Walter in 1967 and ending with a dive team in a medical examiner's office in 2025, who kept a file open long after most would have let it close. Roy Benn's disappearance is now officially an accident, but the story of how that accident stayed hidden for 58 years through failed searches, quiet DNA sample collected years before anyone knew it would matter, and a stroke of luck on a Sunday afternoon, belongs to a broader pattern this channel returns to again and again. Cases where the evidence was never as far away as investigators believed, and where the truth, once it finally surfaces, rarely matches the story everyone had already decided to believe.